So tonight, what you're going to be looking at is not a formalized debate, but rather a panel discussion where we're encouraging our students to listen to each other and hear different experiences. University of Arizona is a very large campus, and Ramapo, the thing that I love the most about it, is how small and intimate the student population is. And we wanted to look at how it is that students are looking at activism in those two different contexts. Our umbrella topic this year is asking who is Generation Z. This is a generation who was born between 1996 and 2010. And one thing that I noticed, I went into the pandemic being roughly the same generation as my students, and I came out of the pandemic going into the classroom and realized that I was in a totally different generation than my students. I turned 40 this year, and as any generation who has recently aged out of relevance, I look at my students and I go, I'm really curious about who this new generation is, and I go into conversations with them. Sometimes I disagree with the things that they say. Sometimes I'm intrigued by them, but what I always am every time is optimistic, and I think that you will all be as well as soon as you hear what they have to say this evening, and especially because they are going to be led by our guest speaker this evening, who I'm very happy to say I'll be bringing up. We'll be having a little bit of a talk, and then we'll get to hear his brilliant words as well. So our guest speaker tonight is going to be Angus Johnston. He is a historian of American student activism in higher education. He teaches at the Hostos Community College at SUNY and has written on student issues for publications ranging from the Chronicle of Higher Education to Rolling Stone. He can be found on Twitter, which he refuses to call X, which is my absolute favorite part of the bio that he gave us. So he's going to come on up and tell us a little bit about his perspective. So hi, Angus. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I know that you had told me one of the reasons you were interested in joining us today was that the pandemic made it so that you weren't able to have a lot of in-person events like this and contact with students. So can you talk a little bit more about why it is that you find that to be a real pleasure and an important part of education?
Yeah, we were just talking about this a moment ago, that I find that most folks who are not students, who are talking in the media about today's students, have very limited contact with students, right? Either they are think tank people or pundits or whatever, who the only students they ever encounter are the ones who are yelling at them on Twitter, or they have an interaction with students at their one campus, right? They are faculty members or administrators who have a lot of information about a very small number of students. One of the things that I have been lucky to be able to experience throughout my career is working as a mentor for state and national student organizations and helping them out with stuff, which has allowed me to come in contact with a really big cross-section of students. Not a full cross-section of students, but a lot of different kinds of students beyond the ones that I interact with as a professor. And that has been much less of a thing in the last few years, right? And we were having very much fewer in-person conferences. There is much less going on the campuses. It is beginning to come back now. But as I'm going to talk about in just a moment, this is this weird moment of breakage, right? This weird split in our history as a country. And I think it's a particularly acute split in the history of higher education, particularly from the perspective of students. And so one of the things that I am hoping that tonight serves as, and having met with these 6 folks, I'm really excited for, is that this is a bit of a reintroduction of many of us to a new generation of students, which is always exciting.
And let's just add on to that the idea of how important it is to have that introduction to these students. We were talking backstage earlier about the sort of myth of the current student population, and it's certainly, I think, not a new myth. It's something that's sort of perpetuated about college students for at least half a century. This because I was saying earlier that what I hear students presented as, which is these sort of like Marxists in training who are all there to just perform their activism on social media without any actual investment. It seems completely different from my actual experience being in the classroom with students. So can we talk a little bit about why that myth is perpetuated and why it is that we continually sort of hear this over and over again, why it won't die?
Yeah, I think one big piece of that is that it's something that we are all familiar with, those of us who are faculty, which is that you have to continue to reinvent yourself or things are going to fall apart in the classroom, right? There was a period of time when I was talking about the tulip craze of the early 1600s and talking about the way in which people went nuts for tulips in Holland in the 1630s. I could say it was like Beanie Babies. And then I got to a point where nobody knew what Beanie Babies were. And then I had little kids, and I could say it was like silly bands. You remember last summer the way that kids were about silly bands? And now silly bands are a thing of the past as well. And so most of the time it's just, you sit and you awkwardly wait for a laugh that doesn't come, or you, as a student, you sit and awkwardly wait for the professor to stop waiting for the laugh that doesn't come. But sometimes that becomes much more of an intense situation, right? Sometimes it becomes a situation where a professor has been talking in the same way for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and the sands have shifted underneath you, right? I will note that many of you noticed that I said earlier without thinking it's kind of nuts. That's not a thing I would do in the classroom anymore. It's not a thing I would generally do in a speaking engagement like this. I haven't spoken in front of a crowd like this in several years, so I'm a little rusty. But thinking about the way that people use language, thinking about the way that people understand themselves and their relationships to other people, there are new consensuses being built all the time, right? This is not a new phenomenon. I remember being a college student in the 1990s and having a philosophy professor talking about the ancient Greeks, and he got up at one point when we were talking about the ancient Greek philosophers' perspectives on erotic love, and they were like, okay, we're going to pretend that we're talking about men and women so that it'll be identifiable to all of you, right? So that you all be comfortable with it. And us in the 1990s were like, wait, what? What the hell did you even just say, right? If we had gotten mad at him, he would have been really confused, right? Because he had been using that line for 30 years, and it had always been fine. There is that thing that happens in the classroom, right? Where if things are going well, it's an incredible bond, and it's an incredible building of community, right? If things are going well between you and your students, it's this extremely intense experience. And when you feel like the students are betraying you, when you feel like the students are rejecting what you are offering them, that is emotionally, if you are not prepared for it, that can be a very difficult thing to manage. And we talked earlier about some of the specifics of this. So many times when I hear about a situation where a faculty member has been canceled, as a faculty member is being protested, it is a result of them not paying attention to the ways in which society is changing and them not being prepared to adjust to that change as it happens, right? Digging your heels in and saying, in another now extremely old cultural reference, no, it is the children that are wrong, right?
And when we see those situations where we have faculty members who are in the middle of a sort of clamorous situation with their students, which tends to probably usually be best solved by communication between the professor and the students. How is it that we tend to, not to speak in generalities, but that we see administrations responding to that? Do we see that administrations tend to be sort of siding with the students or with the professors, or are they just sort of putting out boilerplate HR approved, statements for the world. What do we usually see administrations doing?
Well, I think one distinction that's really important to make is the distinction between adjunct faculty and tenured
Sure.
faculty and tenure track faculty, right? Because as we all know, adjunct faculty have a lot less protection, and adjunct faculty can just disappear, and nobody has to explain why it happened, right? And so those kinds of situations are a lot harder to judge from the outside, and maybe you don't even find out about it, right? Because it is just, they just no longer teach. When we're talking about tenured faculty, tenure track faculty are in a slightly different situation, but when you're talking about tenured faculty, what generally happens is that if the process, any sort of a formal process plays out, the protections of tenure are going to work on your behalf, right? You are going to be able to weather the storm. But one of the things that tends to happen in the cases that come to public awareness is that we will hear that somebody was fired, but actually what happened was they were under investigation, and during the course of that investigation, they decided to retire or decided to move on to something else, right? Firing of a tenured faculty member is very unusual, but a tenured faculty member deciding, you know what, this is not pleasant anymore, this is not fun anymore, this is not an environment that I feel at home anymore, that's something that happens fairly frequently. Not frequently in terms of a percentage of the total faculty, but much more frequently than a faculty member being fired.
And to that point, I mean, and it's great that you started that by saying, let's look at the difference between adjunct and tenured faculty. And this is the last question I'll ask because I don't want to take too much time away from you and the students. But we were speaking before about how important it is to understand campus culture when talking about campus culture. And again, sort of when I see representations of what campuses look like in media, it almost always seems to be characterized by people who have no idea what a university is. So if you could speak for just a minute or two about the singular nature of what a campus community is supposed to be. I mean, I see it as the laboratory of ideas where you're meant to say things that are unusual and probably sound a little bit strange to people who are outside of those contexts. But for some reason, they keep on being taken as like orthodox in doctrine. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the unusual, unique nature of a campus community, and then what we can bring on?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to say about that is that one of the big problems that we have right now in our country in terms of how we understand students and the campus more broadly is 99 times out of 100, a student protest or an example of student organizing or a dispute on campus, a letter to the editor of the student newspaper or a student newspaper editorial, or even just an interaction in the classroom, is not, the intended audience for that is not the country as a whole, right? The way that people are using language, the way that people are engaging with each other, the stakes, the things that they are trying to achieve are in most cases not about trying to change the country, right? And yet we have this spyglass trained on every campus now that student newspapers are online and people are bringing cameras into the classroom, and since I mean, it's not just student newspapers being online, it's national pundits reading student newspapers and deciding to write a column in the New York Times about a letter to the editor. It's a very strange thing for an adult human being to do. But a campus is a community, and a campus is an institution. And if you don't understand the nature of that community and you don't understand the nature of that institution, you're going to get it all wrong.
I think that's absolutely true. So let's try to make sure that everyone gets it all right by listening to what everyone has to say tonight. Thank you so much. So Angus, you can say a few words.
Yes, thank you.
To the podium, and then we're going to bring on the students.
Thank you. So I did not actually know what Ted was going to ask me, so I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much here. But I will begin by something that was implicit in what I just said, and make it explicit, which is that where I start as both a historian of American student activism, a historian of higher education, and also as a classroom teacher, where I start is from the premise that students are the core of the university, right? That students are the core of the campus. You can have faculty doing research without students, but that's not a college, right? That's a think tank or a research institute or something else, right? Faculty teaching students, as much as we get out of it, we are doing it for the students, right? If the students are not there to learn and there to get a degree and there to get a grade and there to get accredited and all of that, then the classroom as it is constituted doesn't exist, right? So students are the core of the university, and they are central to the university in a different way as well, because particularly at a residential campus, for faculty and administrators, the campus is our job, right? We go to work, we do our job, we come home, we do our job at home as well, right? We are grading and writing and that kind of stuff. But the campus is our job. Whereas for students, in my experience as an undergraduate student, the campus was where I lived, right? It was my home. It was the place where I worked. It was the place where I hung out with my friends. It was the place where I spent a lot of my free time. It was the place where I met the person who I would fall in love with and who would become the mother of my children, and the place where we worked long hours in student government and student organizing, right? The campus was the heart of my life, right? The campus is much more important in the life of a student than it is in the life of a faculty or administrator, however important as it is to us. But at the same time that that is true, it is also true that students are transient, right? Students come and then they leave, right? And one of the things that is that's reflected in is the fact that a generation in the life of students is over in an instant, right? The period of time from when you arrive to when you leave is a period of tremendous change for you. It is also a period, can be, of tremendous change on the campus, right? I was an undergrad in the 80s and 90s, and so we were doing a lot of cool stuff, but we were constantly looking back at the 60s, right? The 60s was the moment that we looked back at in those days. And it was only really when I started doing research that I realized how short the 60s that we imagine are, right? From the Port Huron Statement, which is the defining document of SDS, which you look back on and you say, this was the big document of the 60s, to the collapse of SDS and the Weather Underground bombings, that's 6 years. And if you read the Port Huron Statement, it is a very dorky liberal document, written by a lot of the same folks who were involved in the weather disputes 6 years later, right? You go in 6 years from, what reads like some, liberal senators' talking points in some points to people talking about how great the Manson family are and killing the pigs and all of this kind of stuff. And that happens because a generation in student life is very short. It is constantly changing. It is constantly evolving. So students are simultaneously the core of the university and ghosts within the university. And if you want to understand how higher education works, you need to understand that. And one of the pieces that's very important of that, and I may get a chance to talk about this a little bit later, is that student power within the university is incredibly hard to build and incredibly easy to break. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to build it, but often all you need to do to break it is wait for the students who built it to graduate, right? Because then you'll be able to get away with stuff. You wait till the summer after the folks who got the new rule put in place, they all graduate, you wait for the summer, and when everybody comes back in September, the new rule is gone, right? The campus is really weird. The campus is fascinating. And it is fascinating to all of us, I think, in part because it is maybe the only major institution in American society that is big enough to matter and small enough for individual people to influence. and individual people who are in their teens and early 20s. It's a wild thing. It's an incredible thing. This is where I was going to do a history of student power since the 1950s. I have already talked a lot, so I'm not going to do that. But the history is a history of great gains in the late 60s and 70s, consolidated to a large extent in the 70s and 80s, and then gradually disappearing since then. And I can talk about that more later if we get a chance. But one of the things that hit me just today is that every one of our 6 panelists today is a student who began as a college student after the start of COVID. This is a post-COVID generation of students. And if you think of what I was saying about the transience of students and the difficulty of maintaining institutional knowledge, right? The difficulty of maintaining traditions, if you have a year where everybody is off campus, well, that was a year when all of the seniors were going to be preparing to have the next generation come over and take over their clubs and their organizations, right? And that year doesn't happen. That was a year when the leadership of student government was going to be finding and grooming and training their replacements and telling them which administrators are going to tell you the truth and which of them are going to lie. And that year never happens. It was a year of first-year students coming onto campus and seeing how the campus works. And that gap means that we are entering an entirely new era. We are at the beginning, the dawn of a new era in American higher education. And anybody who tells you that they know what it's going to look like is lying or not that bright. We are on the verge of something new, and I am thrilled to introduce 6 representatives of that something new to talk about how they see it and what they see as going on. So could we all give them a hand as they come up onto the stage? Could we all continue to give them a hand as they continue to come up to the stage? All right, so what's going to happen here next is that these folks are going to give some introductory statements, and then we're going to have a bit of a back and forth between us. And then as soon as possible, we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. And they will be answering the questions from the audience, and I may also chime in on some of those. But given how much time we've already taken up, I want to get to the audience questions as soon as possible. So let me just begin by introducing the folks I'm about to turn it over to. From the University of Arizona, excuse me, I've already mispronounced 2 words, but none of them were a student's name, so I'm really thrilled about that. We have Andrew Pongratz, no, there I did it. Andrew Pongratz, a sophomore studying philosophy, politics, economics, and law. We have next to him Hunter Gibbs, junior studying environmental science, and Ananya Singhvi is a junior studying economics and marketing. And from Ramapo College, we have Sarah Glisson, a freshman studying political science, Bex Rodriguez, a freshman studying history, and Dominique Walton, a sophomore studying creative writing. So I will turn it over to y'all. Thank you so much for being here.
Cool. I'm from India, and this is my first time speaking in front of this many people in the US. Really excited. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is my utmost pleasure to stand before you and delve into a meaningful discussion on Gen Z and campus activism. I'm grateful for my friends from the University of Arizona and Ramapo College for their teamwork and dedication. I'm grateful to Ted McClure and the faculty of Ramapo again to make this happen, and lastly, our honorable moderator, Angus Johnston, for his precious time. As we embark on this campus activism discussion, it is imperative that we begin by understanding some core concepts at the heart of our discussion: campus activism and Gen Z. According to my teammates and I, campus is an intellectual battleground with the vibrant community fostering learning, friendships, personal growth, and exchange of ideas freely. And activism on campus as a passionate and proactive engagement in social, political, or environmental issues by students and faculty. Lastly, Generation Z, the generation that is the pioneer of progressive movements, the master of turning everyday issues into viral hashtags. Generation Z, with their digital fluency and unwavering commitment to social causes, has achieved remarkable successes on campuses worldwide, big or small. Their relentless advocacy has sparked essential conversations on critical issues such as climate change, mental health, gender equality, and more. Gen Z has shown us the incredible power of collective action. However, in the pursuit of change, there have been moments of challenge and reflection. Campus activism, while making strides, has faced criticism and opposition, sometimes encountering resistance from established systems or even encountering the occasional missteps in strategies or messaging. These moments serve as vital lessons, reminding us of the complexities and nuances inherent in any transformative movement. As we delve into the realm of Generation Z and campus activism, our purpose today is not to simplify the discussion into a binary narrative of success or failure, but to appreciate a rich tapestry of Gen Z's campus activism. Let's embrace the diversity of opinions, seek common ground, and find inspiration in dynamism of the youth. It's through these conversations that we can collectively shape a brighter future. Let's open our minds, engage in thoughtful dialogue, and explore the successes and failures, not as endpoints, but as stepping stones in the larger story of progress. I would mark an end to my opening statement in very own words of our moderator. Forgive me while I do that. The American campus today, as it has been in the past, is a site of robust and passionate debate. And that's true not only because it's the place of learning, but also because it is a haven of young people. Thank you.
What does 1997 have in common with 2012? If you couldn't think of anything right off the bat, it's probably due to the 15-year gap in between these years. In 1997, I was non-existent. I'm sure the 90s were great, I just wasn't there for them. 2012, however, I was a full-fledged second grader, ambitiously learning about advanced addition and subtraction. The important thing about these 2 years is not the years themselves, but the range. If you were born between 1997 and 2012, you are a member of Generation Z. Assuming most students here today are a part of Gen Z, I'd like to start with a question. Do you identify with your generation? When I think about my stereotypes for Gen Z, the first thing that comes to mind is modernization. We are the future, and as the dawn of the iPad babies, we understand technology perhaps a little bit more than millennials and a lot more than Generation X. Our positive stereotypes are modern or innovative, are negative, chronically online, or spoiled, stubborn, and out of touch. Have you noticed, however, when these negative stereotypes come to light? A lot of the hate that our generation receives is beyond the dinner table. Uncle Mike might be screaming about politics at Thanksgiving, but he's not really naming specific generations, is he? This takes me to the goal of our discussion today, and this is also a remind you that this is the first discussion that either Ramapo College or the University of Arizona has ever held. We are panelists, yet more importantly, we are students initiating a discussion about other students. Because what else are Gen Zs known for? If you're thinking of activism, you're on the right track. On April 29th, 1970, the United States invaded Cambodia. 5 days later, on May 4th, 1970, 3,000 students gathered at Kent State University to protest the Vietnam War, despite the attempts of college officials to shut the entire thing down. 100 Ohio National Guardsmen met the protesters. When the students began to shout and throw rocks, these guardsmen fired into the crowd, killing 4 students and wounding 9. The next day, a nationwide student strike took place involving over 4 million participants. This protest occurred 53 years ago, so why is it relevant today? We suggest because nothing has changed. Across the nation, including Arizona, and over here at Ramapo too, where an anti-Vietnam War protest was also held in 1970, there are still measures in place to prevent students from protesting and activism. As an increasingly digital generation, our means of outreach have changed. We no longer rely on major news networks or papers to spread our message. We turn to platforms like TikTok or Twitter or X, sharing our efforts online to a global audience. Because of this, student activists are regulated not only on campus, but online too. I believe most students here at Ramapo College would agree that we have a voice on campus. Perhaps you've seen activism on campus. Even better, maybe you've participated. Great. But what if I told you that we could be doing more? What if I told you that even when you thought you were attending a defiant campus protest, that protest was likely approved by administration before it occurred? What if I told you that the poster you read outside of A-Wing promoting a student assembly went through a thorough approval process before even considering being printed? Is it really activism? Is it really free speech when your efforts have to follow a code of conduct? The Ramapo College panelists look forward to exploring Gen Z campus activism in our discussion with the University of Arizona students today. We hope today's discussion will help you recognize the power our generation wields. We urge you to start thinking of questions you may have. These can be general or specific, it's up to you. Your involvement in our discussion today makes it a worthwhile experience. Thank you.
All right, so now that we've had a brief moment of sort of a more lengthy introduction from two of you, would the rest of the other 4 of you, oh, I'm sorry, I just realized that I did not. No, I did, sorry. Again, it's been several years since I've done this before. You're gonna have to bear with me. So, Bex, would you like to say a few words of introduction to begin?
Okay, sure. So, as a panel majority freshman, we know what it's like to be relatively young members of Generation Z. We, as he has previously said, we are students that did come in a post-COVID world. So this is like all new frontier for us because there's obviously the college that was beforehand, everyone was active, and then we're in COVID where everything is online. There's no longer any in-person anything. But we were doing research and we found a lot of stuff about the origin of activism and what we can and can't do on our campus. So during the first decade, the college was open. Students had to run many protests to fight for things they believed in. This includes boycotting the cafeteria to protest food for more lower prices, holding peaceful protests, and having protests for the Black Lives Matter movement. That's the origin of our college.
So I would also like to say that a lot of us have done activism in the past before COVID. So for us, experiencing this in a higher education setting as well as post-pandemic is quite interesting for us. So we wanted to talk about it.
And just to echo what my colleagues from Ramapo have already said, my colleagues from Arizona and I were very excited to be here today. And I think we'll really get into the weeds of what those differences are between kind of very large public universities and smaller universities. We've got 45,000 undergrads at the University of Arizona, so we are massive. So it's very exciting to see the turnout here. We would never get the turnout for any event of this many students on our campus, and that lends itself to campus culture and the size of the campus as well. So we're excited to be here and to dive right in.
Yeah, I'm going to be sharing a lot about my experiences in environmental activism, being a part of our campus climate action plan, and also running a climate anxiety related service project at the university. And I would also love if you all did engage in activism in high school. I would love to see how COVID-19 pandemic affected your movements. I'd love to see how activism has evolved through the generations and get into discussing that. And then also our tenuous relationship with administrations and how we rely on them for change. Yet at the same time, we also have a lot of distrust in them in their empty promises and words in their agreements with students. And ultimately, I'd also love to see how activism itself has changed and has been defined by Generation Z, especially with the advent of the internet. So we cannot wait to get into this discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I think what I'd like to do is throw it open to each of the two panels and ask you two questions. I'll give you both of them to start so you can start thinking of them both. First is, whichever of you, one or more, would like to handle this, to talk a little bit about where you see the challenges currently facing students on your campus right now as being, and then once we have a little discussion about that from each of the campuses, talk a little bit about what Hunter just said about the effect of COVID-19 on activism on your campus. So let's start with the Ramapo, whichever of you would like to go first, thinking about what are the big issues that this campus is facing right now as far as you're concerned.
All right, I can start. So I kind of wanted to talk, I know it's all Ramapo students in the audience, but we all had, I'll explain for the Arizona students a little, we had a pastor come to our school, Pastor Stanley, and he was kind of here to spread, I want to say like religious propaganda, but he was kind of, his signs were just kind of like showing us like the truth of life, and he was very religious, yeah. And there was a big divide clearly right off the bat between those like students who identify as queer and this pastor. And it was very interesting to me because this was when I started like my preliminary research for this discussion. And I just remember looking at like these students, and there was a good divide. And I spoke to the pastor, and I heard him out respectfully and just let him hand me his pamphlets. Not that I necessarily agreed with them. But I did notice that some of the other students were standing there screaming in his face. And it was just a very aggressive front. And you kind of, I feel like that's kind of like the value of education, where when you know so much about activism, when you're kind of looking at that, you're able to realize the trends, that it's not really effective when you're sitting there screaming at someone. And I think that's a policy that I've seen in colleges specifically, where protesting and activism has this sort of stigma. And it's always, we've kind of always, I debated starting with a theory in my intro, where if there's two rooms, and in one, all the students are in a really heated discussion, and in the other, the same students are just chilling on a computer, which one are you gonna pick? You're probably gonna pick the one where they're all chilling, you know, like, because everyone's afraid of, I wanna say uproar, of heated, and we assume that peace is silence, is kind of what I found. But what I also found is that when these students were screaming at the pastor, it wasn't exactly effective. But the colleges have kind of adapted this approach where now we're not allowed to protest on campus. They have measures. So, oh, please don't protest. Actually speak to this administrator. Please don't protest. Go speak to this organization. Where it's kind of like the stigma where nothing can get done when students are protesting. It's just supposed to be like a means, like meet this person, then meet this person, then meet that person, then meet that person. So it was kind of just a chain of like stereotypes, which was really interesting to me. You have anything to add?
I mean, on our campus, if we want to do anything, we have to get it approved by higher up. So if we want to make posters, it needs to be approved. I work at the Women's Center sometimes, so they asked me to hang up a poster, and so I asked if I could put it in my dorm, and they were like, oh, you have to get it approved by someone else. Then it goes through a whole entire chain that by the end you're just exhausted and you don't want to do it anymore. So they're really trying to like slow down your changes, and they're trying to make you tired so that at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like you going through all of this is worth it.
Mm-hmm. But it almost like suggests that, is this intentional? It's almost like I feel like colleges kind of think that they're providing all these resources for us and creating the opportunity for us to bring forth our concerns and create change. But it's almost like the amount of people that you have to talk to and the amount of outlets that you have to go to even facilitate any type of this change makes it confusing. I know that I'm a delegate in our student government right now, and even with student government alone, everyone has a different position and a different role, which is great because it shows student representation, but then it also, from an outside outside perspective, if I was a student going to the government to talk about them or like something that I wanted to change, who would I even speak to first? And you just kind of, I don't know, you get into that little cycle of it is exhausting.
Yeah, I'd also like to add, I had an incident with someone and then I had to report it. And don't get me wrong, the people I talked to were very helpful, but it took about 8.5 to 9 months for a solution, which was almost the entire school year. And like, don't get me wrong, these people were great to talk to and they helped me validate my experience. But if I didn't have the perseverance to go through and to like stop all of that, it would just continue and then the next person would have to deal with this person and it would be creating a cycle.
Right, and are there any clear, I want to ask them too, like, as far as things that we feel are very important to Ramapo, I think that definitely, like we were talking about, like queer individuals, that's a big thing with activism on campus. But even that, like we can say that what happened with Pastor Stanley was activism, but then like if we really take a step back, was it? Because I feel like, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but like I found out very last minute that he was coming to campus. And it felt like there was almost limited time to organize anything or to even plan anything. So all we really had there was like markers and posters and angry students. And it kind of like, you start to think about like, what is even defined as activism? Was that a protest or was it just a response?
And I'd like to jump in here too, to kind of to echo what our colleagues from Ramapo have been talking about. You know, at the University of Arizona, since we're such a massive campus, you know, we don't have things like that where our posters have to get approved through a centralized source just because it would be a logistical nightmare. I mean, there's posters on campus that, you know, we don't have anything like what you guys have here with a centralized place to put all your posters in your student center. I mean, we have a student union, but each department has its own places where students can post stuff. So it really turns into this thing of a lot of issues that we have with activism and organizing on our campus is just to get the word out. You know, if I put a poster up in the student union, I mean, people might see it, they might not see it. You know, there's a poster in my department in political economy and moral science from I think 3 years ago, talking about an event, and no one's taken it down yet. So it's just things like that where you're like, you know, so we, you know, just looking at that difference between the campus sizes. I mean, we really struggle just to get the word out in general when, you know, we're trying to get people to back an idea or to support a solution, whatever it might be. But yeah, it's certainly an interesting point.
Yeah, and summarizing what you all said, and also from Sarah's speech, that is it free speech when you have to follow a code of conduct? But I would also like to emphasize on the fact that Gen Z these days share a two-fold relationship with the institution where they want free speech, but at the same time demand for safe space. We have had an incident on our campus where pro-life protesters came and they put up some graphics which they thought was important to demonstrate the severity of the whole protest, but the student community found it very disturbing, and they asked for more strict actions towards such protesters, which can be bad for mental health of these students. And so is that really free speech? So if they put restrictions, you ask for free speech, but if there are no restrictions, you demand for a safer campus. And I think that really highlights the dual nature of relationship that we share with our institutions. And also connecting with that is we are really, really skeptic about our own institutions, but we still look up to them for positive change. We are demanding a change from them, and we still do not have faith in them. And I would like Hunter to talk more about it.
Yeah, I would love to speak specifically to university presidents and their role in uplifting student activism and their role in the bureaucracy as well. And I'd like to break down 3 different situations that one might come across at different campuses throughout the United States. So if you have a president of a small school that has like full support and it's a more ideologically homogenous body, for example, at Trinity Washington University, that president highlighted critical race theory, denounced climate deniers and anti-maskers very openly without any repercussion. But then at a larger university, such as California State Monterey Bay, or even the University of Arizona, multiple quotes from these individuals point to the idea how you have to be very careful on how you address issues of concern without alienating people. And this touches on the University of Arizona. We often champion free speech, and we're one of the freest speaking nations in the world, and we allow these pro-life protesters to run rampant and instill fear in people. But at the same time, we fail to stand in solidarity with our students who are trying to get their issues to the board, especially as it pertains to women's issues and the recent Roe v. Wade decision as well. And then there's even worse incidents, such as at Lyon College, where you have a small school in a state like in the deep South that might not support you. For example, in Lyon College, former President Joey King was forced to resign due to his commentary on simply the importance of institutional diversity to combat white supremacy, just due to this sheer amount of backlash that president underwent. And mind you, he is Black himself. And this ultimately highlights the tenuous struggle between those who want presidents to vocally represent them and then those who expect nonpartisanship and them to allow this no reins battleground with no organization, and can lead to a lot of hate and fear. And it's really an institutional struggle that the University of Arizona faces in advancing its own issues. And we ask ourselves, how can we trust the administration after this pro-life incident and after these really weak, lukewarm statements from our president?
All right, so I'm going to come back around to you all again for some comments specifically about COVID-19. For those of you who have questions, here's how we're going to do that. We had a technical situation planned, but it's glitched, so we're going to do it a slightly different way. If you have a pen and paper, you can write down questions. Be sure to write clearly so that it's easy to read. If not, if you don't have access to a pen and paper and you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and somebody will come down and write it down for you, and then those questions will be brought up to us. So if you can write it down yourself, or if you can share paper with a neighbor, that would be great. If not, just raise your hand and we're going to have folks to come around and take down your questions. All right, so having said that, so what has your experience as students been, particularly in terms of campus climate and organizing in the wake of the COVID-19 shutdowns?
So I'll start first. For me, I have noticed that there has been a little bit more difficulty with organizing everything, especially in wake of the pandemic, where a lot of people don't want to be in the same room at once, so close together, which is completely valid. I do not blame them. But then the question is, what do we do in place of that that's still as powerful as what it once would have been? For instance, when I was in high school before the pandemic, we were protesting something and we had about 10,000 students outside of the government's office. Now, we could not do that because that is way too many people in one spot, but it's hard to get the government's attention and the governor's attention through social media or through an email or something like that. That could be easily just ignored, log out your account, you know.
And I think to chime in here, coming out of COVID, trying to connect with people in different ways has always been a challenge, whether we be in the classroom or, just talking about events and that sort of thing. I ran for student body president last year for the University of Arizona, and our voter turnout was abysmal. I think, so we've got 45,000 undergrads. We had 1,000 people vote in total. So I don't need to do the math for you, but that percentage is horrible. And that's not to say that people don't care about voting at Arizona or they're just, maybe not politically engaged, but it came down to the fact that most people didn't even really know that we had a student government, and I think that really speaks volumes to, it's an ongoing challenge of how do we tell students that, hey, you've got resources, you've got elected representatives that are here to help you, but really try to engage them and say, hey, that, how can we solve our solutions collaboratively, solve our problems collaboratively, create solutions. And it's certainly, it's certainly an ongoing challenge. I'll put it that way.
And also to add on that onto that positively, I think what is different between our generation and the older generations is social media. It is difficult to collect people, but also at the same time, I think it has become really easy if you want to spread out some information like overnight. We have this campus pantry at UA campus, and it serves a lot of students and faculties and staff by providing them food and all the essential stuff they need for free. And they were severely underpaid, but and they were going to shut down. But then one day they just released a statement, and everybody started sharing it all over social media. It reached faculties, and they had downpour of donations, and now they're doing so well. So I think that is something that we stand apart from other generations for. Our social media presence is very, very strong.
I would also like to touch on my experience post-COVID right in high school as a junior. That was right after the COVID pandemic, and then also in college. So as I was going in my junior year, which was 2020, I started a chapter of a club called We Dine Together, and that essentially provided a forum for students who felt socially isolated to come and discover their community and get them connected with various groups on campus. And that was very successful because one of the main impacts of COVID, as we may talk about, was certainly mental health and social isolation. And that club has grown to about 40 people and is still run today. But now moving into university, into Students for Sustainability, which is what I was a member of, one of the main environmental organizations on campus, there's still a lot of struggle getting back onto our feet and getting back into legislative advocacy and being confined more to just the university. And luckily, we are pursuing our climate action plan now and are writing it out, but I think we're just getting our bearings after 3 years, and there certainly was some difficulty passing off the reins of organizations to younger students.
Yeah, and just to kind of emphasize on that, when I was a freshman in high school when COVID first occurred, wow. And I just remember that, like, coming out of it, the first thing that my school did was set up, it was called a crisis center, and like there was a bunch of regulations with it. You could go for like 15 minutes, which they let you stay longer, but it had all this regulations that came with it. But it was just interesting to me because it was almost like all this stuff happened during the pandemic. It was crazy. And being online, all of it was thrown at us. I knew so much information that I had never known before, and I did not know how to digest it. But what I say this for is that coming out of it now, there's almost this social understanding that mental health is real and it exists. And I still find stigmas with it because, okay, anxiety and depression is okay, but when we get into like schizophrenia and bipolar, that's when it kind of gets into murky waters. But it's interesting to me because I've kind of found that as social stereotypes change, the political climate surrounding that always changed. I think if I were out in the Grove right now protesting, pro-life and saying that I was pro-choice, I would get a very more political response than I would if I were out there saying that anxiety matters. So I think that's also kind of interesting to pose the question of what exactly is important to us, and even the things that are important to us, why is it not important to the college?
For those of you who are in the audience, this is the QR code, which we have managed to get up and running. So you can, in addition to writing down your questions or having somebody come around, if you take an image of that QR code, that will take you to a place where you can submit questions online. Do we have any questions yet, or are we still working on that? Still working on that? Yes? They're going to what? Oh, they're going to be put up. Okay, so when we have questions, they will be put up. So what is, you mentioned the very low turnout for student government elections. And one of the things that was always my experience as an undergrad in national organizing was that it's very, very common that the largest colleges have the least involvement in student government because of the size, because it just sort of disappears with everything else. What is the level of involvement in the student government here at Ramapo?
I believe it's very involved because we are very lucky to have senators at large and different students who are involved. And in fact, you can get started as early as a freshman in your first semester if you really wanted to get involved for student government. But I know student government, the office is a little bit out of the way from the student center, so many students will pass it throughout the day, so they're constantly reminded that we do have a student government. as well as students get an email blast whenever we have any voting for anything. And there are delegates that you can ask any questions, or if you want to see change in your community, you can go to your delegates.
I think it's also kind of valuable that we are considerably a smaller campus than U Arizona. And because of that, we do these things here called tablings, which I'm sure everyone has seen at least one organization at a table. And we do these at kind of like the hot spots. I've complained about Birch Tree Inn many times, but it is one of like the only dining halls here. And if you're not going to Birch, you're going to the atrium, which just so happens to be in the same building as Birch. And if we put a table out there, students are destined to pass it at some point. If you're going to A-Wing and you take the back route, you're going to pass it. So I think that's also an interesting perspective as far as with our student government and the turnout rates. And it's also because it's a smaller campus, it's a smaller culture, and the people who are involved in our student government, we know them, we have them on Instagram, we are in classes with them, maybe they're in our dorming hall. So it just kind of provides that interesting category of when there's a saying like power by the people. When you know the people who are representing you, you're probably more inclined to be an active member in that than I imagine at a larger campus.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny that right now, if you check my email, I will have 1,000 unread messages because the event blast or whatever it is, it's just so many. There are so many organizations on campus that it's not possible to read all of them and like be involved in all those events. So I agree, like the participation is a problem, but at the same time, I would also say that if we all decide to support something, I think the effect is really, really large and positive because as a part of large campus, coming from Tucson, I think the whole Tucson community is integrated with University of Arizona. And so if something shakes U of A, it shakes the whole community. And so the impact is really, really broad. I would like to know how is it for you? How is the relationship how is the community's relationship with Ramapo College?
I mean, I can comment. I've been here for a month. So I'm still like, that is kind of the beauty of it, where I'm still kind of figuring it out. It's also an interesting perspective for me because I've kind of said that this is a suitcase school, which we all know what that means. You see the cars on Friday and they're all leaving. But I'm from 2 hours south, so I don't have that luxury. So I not only am I learning more about my college campus every day, I'm learning more about the community every day. And I do know, as far as if we're going to talk beyond voting at the campus level, we can also talk about voting in your community. And the general elections are coming up. This is my time to promote, get registered to vote, you have a voice. But it's also interesting because a lot of students, you can change your address and you can vote here and have MAWA as your address. And you could affect policies here in your in this community, which I know most of you are from this community too. But I don't know, I feel like that's an interesting perspective. And I think that if we're going to talk realistically, the community is very in tune. They're very happy with Ramapo because we're not in their polls. But I think if students were to get more involved with their polls, Gen Zs have a voice, and it's not typically the voice that we've seen with Generation X and millennials. The political tides are changing, and I think that if that starts to be more representative in actual government, as we all, like the first election I ever voted in was the last primaries. I just turned 18. Like I'm still like, I am just getting into this. And my voice, for the main part, like I've always expressed it, but I've never been eligible to vote. I haven't been able to use it at that political level. So I think that it is kind of like, you can pose that question. How would the community feel if we started to be more involved in politics? Because I feel at the Ramapo level, there is a consensus. And yes, we do have, if we're talking about partisanship, we have the Ramapo Republicans, and we're looking for room for Ramapo progressives. So there is that partisanship that we see at Ramapo, but for the most part, that stays at Ramapo. Like our political affiliations do not really affect the policies that are around us in our community. And that may be because we're still voting in our communities. So our voice is just one of many in the towns that we're from, whereas we could be a much more powerful force if we all were voting in the Mahwah community.
Bex and Dominique, do you want to talk about the community campus relation?
Yeah, of course. So recently at the Ramapo Pride, because we celebrate in October, because we're not open in June. So there was a table, and don't ask me the name of the organization, but I do have their business card. Basically, they are taking in people for volunteers, and they're really trying to get volunteers right now. But I have noticed that if you volunteer there, you can help change the community in Mahwah County, and they will give you free rides to volunteer as well, which I think is pretty profound. But there aren't that many organizations like that nearby, but I think part of that is because the town really isn't walkable. Like, if you don't have a car, there's not really easy places to go. I mean, yes, there is like the public train station, but there's no like easy way to cross Route 17 if we're being honest. So
Been in a car.
in a car. So that is part of the issue. But I would say they're pretty helpful with students.
Bex, go ahead.
I mean, I am kind of one of those suitcase people. I do go home pretty often. I do have a car. I'm lucky that I have a car. But I have gone out a little bit, and sometimes I'll be wearing a Ramapo shirt, and they'll be like, oh, Ramapo, I went there for school. What are you doing on campus? Are they still doing stuff on campus? And then there'll be like people in the community that try and get you invested with what they're invested in because you're on campus, so they assume that you have connections to people on campus. And then it's just kind of like, sorry, I'm a freshman, I don't know anybody.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. One time, before I was a Ramapo student, I went to an open house, and they paired me with someone whose great-grandfather went to Ramapo College, and they were telling me how great it was, but the open house was not for Ramapo. So I feel like that shows how far Ramapo's reach is, even though we're a small school.
I just wanted to add quickly, too, that the Mahwah Pride was a partisanship. Like, if you walked up, they had flyers, and it was like, vote for this person, and it was promoting a Democratic candidate for, well, they're nonpartisan, but it's for the Board of Education, which is involved in the general election that is coming up. It's going to be your state assemblies, it's a general election, but your state assemblies, your state senate, and your Board of Education, and your fire commissioner, and all that good stuff. But as far as Board of Ed, it was kind of interesting, whereas we're not exactly, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but as far as political affiliations as a public college, not all of our community resources are allowed to have a partisanship. I have an internship through the CCC office, and we cannot declare a party. We cannot be a Republican organization, and we cannot be a Democratic organization. But it's kind of interesting because we are a public university, we're a public college, they can come to us and they can express their political ideas. So it's kind of interesting how colleges in that aspect are restrained, but the community around them are not.
I think it's a very interesting perspective because University of Arizona, we're also a public university, and we've got 3 public universities in Arizona, Northern Arizona University, Arizona State, and U of A. And it's interesting because all those institutions are land grant. And that's a big part of our ideals at U of A is that land grant institutions, the community gave you that land to provide a service. And what that service is bettering, future outcomes, whatever it is. And it's fascinating to me that, U of A really rules the roost in Southern Arizona. Our students just they just provided organizing on the subject of free transit in our community. And because of students protesting and talking about these topics, the city of Tucson decided that they would continue providing free transit to everyone in the city. And I think things like that, when our institution speaks up and says, hey, we want this to get done, then Southern Arizona basically has to jump. So I think it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that we see.
I would like to touch back on what Andy said about the idea of us being a land-grant institution. The University of Arizona is on the lands of multiple indigenous tribes, including the Tohono O'odham and also the Pascua Yaqui. And along with that, we see this idea of land acknowledgement statements from the president and university saying we respectfully acknowledge we're on the lands of these indigenous tribes, and we strive to maintain relationships with them. Yet often with that, with this bureaucracy relationship that it has with the community, not a lot ends up happening. And still to this day, the biggest issue with these tribes especially would probably be access to water, with a myriad of mining companies around, and the University of Arizona also contributing to those industries and its endowment as much as $90 billion to fossil fuel industries. So I would like to see sort of from the Ramapo side how your administration has dealt with maybe indigenous relations or relations with the community, and the idea of our colonization on these campuses.
I can talk a little. So I did learn a little bit about this, and yes, we also have President Jeb released a statement, and we do have like the acknowledgement statements because we are on Indigenous land, and we do have it's smaller now, but we do have an active Ramapo Lenape Indigenous community around us. And what I learned is that I was asking about it. I was in like a 5-day program before school called Leaders in Service. And we went to one of our local farms, which is Mevo, and they kind of provide direct, I want to say ingredients for, if you go to the Ramsey market, they're there. So they're very involved in the community. And that's something that I really love about coming to Ramapo. There's pros and cons to every college, but when you come here, the community is aware of Ramapo and they're involved. So I don't know, I love it here, but I don't know. I just thought it is interesting because through Mevo we learned that them directly. I haven't seen any direct things with our campus, and I know that there was a professor who was from the Indigenous community teaching here at one point. I am not aware of that at the moment, but I do know that as far as our community wide, and Ramapo students are a part of the community, and they have volunteered for Mevo, and they have gone and helped. We'll do cleanups. They were talking about there was a big issue with dumping. And it wasn't even necessarily what you like would think it'd be. It's not just like everyday people going and dumping their trash in their land. It's corporations and small businesses who maybe don't have the means to properly dispose of their waste. And so they're dumping it on Indigenous land, which is horrible. And it's something that I feel really, it needs to be talked about more than it is. But then it kind of gets added to the list of there's so many issues going on. Where do we start? Which ones do we cross off first? And how do we do this? So it is a balance between like the community activism and campus activism and when they cross paths and who has more power overall. But as far as Indigenous communities, that's the majority of what I've seen. I believe that Mevo has aided in a lot of cleanups, but it's still happening. Just because you clean up a land doesn't mean that the small businesses stop dumping on it. So it's still a very active issue, and we've almost just delayed the problem instead of addressing the actual issue.
So I am told that we have some questions. Our moderators for the questions are going to be Kalyani Carmaker of Ramapo and Riley Haas of University of Arizona. So I am turning it over to you.
All right, so our first question is, despite Gen Z's quote-unquote inexperience with the real world, do you think that we have some wisdom and insight into real-world problems and issues? How so? Is our supposed inexperience a hindrance?
Should I go?
Go ahead.
Okay. I understand that there is lack of experience, and sometimes we have. That's why our strategies, when we look upon them, sometimes there are missteps. But at the same time, what is happening in the world today is going to impact us the most, because we are the generation who are growing and who are going to live this. And that's why I think it is also very important to consider what are their thoughts about it, and how do they conceive something. For issues like mental health, diversity, equity, inclusion, I think this is something that Gen Z really, really values. And there might be little inexperience in the way the protests are sometimes organized, but at the end, the essence is what are they demanding for.
I would like to touch on the climate perspective a little bit. So since that's my background, but if you think about it, Generation Z and Generation Alpha, et cetera, are going to be the generations living with the planet that older generations gave us, and how horrifically they mistreated it. So they have a moral obligation to absolutely look into what we have experienced, because we've already experienced the most amplified ramifications of climate change, with islands going underwater and minorities living really close to fossil fuel plants and having disproportionately high rates of death and cancer. They have a moral obligation to consult us, especially as we approach that 1.5 degree Celsius rise in temperature before industrialization.
You know, I think to address the point of inexperience, I mean, none of us are professionals at this. I mean, I'm 19 years old. I've got a homework assignment due tonight that I still haven't started yet. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I think our goal with inspiring campus organizing and getting people involved is to create better citizens. I mean, that's the goal of higher education at the end of the day anyway. You know, I could have gone to trade school, become an electrician, plumber, you know, I would have been fine for myself. But ultimately, the reason we get a higher education is to become better citizens, to become better community members. So I think there's a lot of inexperience when it comes to Gen Z doing these things, but that's part of what other generations have done. So I think we're taking up the mantle and pushing it forward, if you will.
Yeah, truly, when you think about it, every generation has had an experience when it comes to protests. But what we can do is we can learn from previous generations. We can learn about the people in 1970 at Ramapo protesting constantly about changes they want to see. We can learn about different protests throughout the world and how it may have worked for them or it may not have worked for them, and then tweak them to work for us.
I mean, I know we catch a lot of flack, Gen Z, for being the snowflakes or the overly sensitive, but all of this is really new for us. We're a generation that doesn't have the problems of our forefathers. I'm going to use that term incorrectly. We don't have the same problems as them. So, I mean, we also don't have like the internet to the same level that they did. I mean, they had the internet like what, early 90s? That's when it hit mainstream, and now we have social media. We can literally organize an event in 5 minutes if you send it a group chat. But yeah, we have to start somewhere, and like by the time that this generation ends, there's going to be a new form of protesting or political activism, and then they're going to have to start from scratch too.
I would also just like to note that as somebody who was on campus in the early 90s, we were accused of being snowflakes at the same time. And my parents' generation was accused of taking everything too seriously and being overly sensitive. The idea that the youth can't take a joke, that the youth are overly sensitive, that the youth are coddled, that the youth are quick to take offense is a consistent theme in American history in the last century at least. Yeah. And on the subject of organization and an experience, my favorite quote from the entire history of student activism came from a guy named Mark Rudd, who was one of the leaders of the protests at Columbia University in 1968, which involved university campus relations with its community, with the war and the war machine. And after the protests of 68, he wrote a long essay about what they had learned from those protests. And in the course of that essay, he said, we must avoid the mistakes of the past so that we can go forward and make the mistakes of the future. The mistakes that you make as organizers are going to be crucial to what you learn how to do. Because if you are not trying stuff that fails, you are just doing stuff that everybody is prepared for. You are doing stuff that everybody knows how to respond to. Going outside of the experience of your target is essential to creating change. And in order to go outside of the experience of your target, you often have to go outside your own experience and improvise in ways which may blow up in your face. Do we have another question?
This question is, how would you guys define hate speech on campus? Is there anything that campus can do to combat and regulate hate speech? And how do you think that students should handle hate speech when campuses don't regulate and address it?
I think oftentimes, even when you talked about the joke, the difference is the jokes are new. The situations that we come across are always new, and that's why the inexperience. But I think the only way to deal with this is dialogue. What are we doing right now is the exact way how we should deal with hate speech and what we want from our institutions as inexperienced Gen Z. There are some times there is a situation where you're asking for free speech, but also you want that safe and inclusive environment. And I think the only way to achieve it is through dialogue and conveying what is hurting your sentiments and what is, and instead of telling people what to do, telling them what not to do. Yeah, maybe that answers the question.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in as well. I think having community leaders or having faculty members or staff who may have been a victim of hate speech and know how it feels, that can definitely make the difference for the victim of the hate speech. because they have what they know they can do that's within their job description or within their power. But they also have that empathetic, like, I've been there and this is how I have coped with it, that may be different, that you might not experience in a less diverse faculty.
Yeah, I think that it poses like an interesting question because like on one hand I just want to be like, well, like at the end of the day you have to know that like those attacks are not educated and just ignore them. But I feel like especially in America I can't say that, especially when like hate is so intertwined with politics and every aspect of our society. And I don't know, there's been events where one tweet has caused an entire riot. What? January 6th. So there's just hate speech it's powerful and it's on our campus. I don't know. It is interesting because we were talking, Hunter mentioned like Deep South, and you were talking about like universities down there. And I imagine, this is from my own bias, that hate speech would probably be prevalent down there. I don't know. I'm going to go out on a hunch. And it just kind of like, it's, you have to think like about like college institutions, because I do feel that like the type of speech that students utilize is a direct result of the environment they are in. I feel here at Ramapo College, I haven't had a direct experience with hate speech, and I haven't heard of a history of hate speech. I'm sure it's there. It's everywhere. But I'm just saying that the culture that we've created here is very close knit, and I want to say educated, but I also feel like it's positive. And I don't know, it's just like I'm going to kind of ask the U Arizona students, like when you have a population that doesn't really know each other and doesn't understand each other, like if I said something offensive, I can name 5 people that I would probably be offending right off the bat. But when you're at a campus that's so large that you don't really know the people around you, how does it kind of compare?
I think it's definitely a good question. And that's why I mentioned that it's really hard to judge what is going to hurt whom. And that's why it's really hard to build a code of conduct of what you can say and what you cannot. But I think dialogue really helps. When something hurts you, you can go and first convey them, okay, I do not like this, or I think that it hurts my sentiments, especially as an international student. U Arizona has tons of international students from all across the world. And I think we all sometimes face issues which others cannot understand. But I think having that support from the institution where we can go and ask them to address our issues, instead of them creating a code of conduct of what we can do and what we cannot, I think I would support free speech with a mechanism where there's a space for the dialogue and discourse.
So I want to touch back to what Ananya said earlier about the pro-life event. I think what you were mentioning, a lack of dialogue, allowed for that event to happen and allowed us to get a really visceral reaction out of the student body, which is probably exactly what that protester was seeking in the first place. They were never seeking dialogue. They were seeking to hurt as many people as possible. So I think that's certainly something that universities could do better, holding more panels just like this from a variety of different backgrounds, and really putting the injustice of some of those ideologies in the spotlight and seeing how strong they really are.
Yeah, I would also like to add, Ramapo does have processes that kind of invite an open dialogue, whether it be something that the student has found offensive to them. So we have an office called EDIC, and then there are people like Miss Rachel Sawyer Walker or Kat McGee who deal with these processes. So what happens is the student comes in and has an open dialogue with any of the faculty members there, and they express what was said or what happened that made them uncomfortable, and then they go through what would make the student feel comfortable. But then after that, they have a dialogue with the professor, whether the student wants to be involved or not. The faculty member will be involved, having a dialogue with like the professor or the faculty member, and then a decision will be reached that the student feels comfortable with.
I think that brings out a very interesting topic, that how easy it is on a small campus to reach that level of hierarchy, the top level of hierarchy, whereas when you're on a huge or big campus, there are just so many steps that if you keep following it, one day you'll be just like, I don't want to do it. I just don't want to do it. But at the same time, there's a large community, such a large community that can take your voice forward and also bring along more and more people to reach that step.
Wonderful. I believe we have time for one more question.
And here we go. Says, do you think that more accommodations that students ask for create more rules and censorship that the college will push onto its students in the name of protection?
I can start this one. I think we actually had this conversation. I'm really happy that this has gone smoothly because we were talking about like what would happen if hate speech was presented to this event in particular. Not that what we're talking about is super controversial, but you never know. And I think that is the interesting aspect when a public university or college places such an importance on free speech, you have to know that all free speech is not going to be what you want it to be. But I think being said with that asking for protection is not censorship. I get, okay, I get that we have free speech, but like if what you're saying, policies cannot be based on like a foundation of hatred. And in my opinion, and based off of research too, if you look at everything that's in our Constitution and the amendments, none of it was based on hate. It was based on protecting life, liberty, property, freedom of speech, like all of these things. I don't know, I feel like censorship is it's something that people like to throw around when they want to be very hateful people and want the protection of it. But I think that it has no role on like public universities. Because we were talking about, I know that you mentioned that it's such a quick turnover from the moment that we get here to the moment that we leave. We come in as like knowledgeable scholars and we leave even more knowledgeable scholars. But you're supposed to learn more than just what your major provides. You're supposed to learn how to be a functioning human and interact with others. And I think that when you're bred in an environment where hate speech kind of just like fluctuates and thrives, you're not going to get what you need out of that education and you're not going to be a better human for it. So do I think that regulating hate speech is censorship? No, not at all.
I think it's challenging for us at Arizona because we are such a large campus and, the University of Arizona campus is the Tucson community. I mean, I'm from Tucson originally. My parents will go walking on campus in the middle of the day. I bump into them all the time and it's really awkward and annoying sometimes. More me deciding to stay in my hometown for college, but that's another story. I think it's difficult though because at Arizona anyway, we really like to emphasize that more dialogue is always better. And part of having these free speech protections is we're going to have folks that say horrible, awful things, but in response, we can respond to those and we can provide education and dialogue. And that's really something we emphasize through the University of Arizona debate series. And as part of our institutional priorities is really expanding dialogue with knowing that, we're going to get some crazy people out there that are going to say horrible things. But at the end of the day, we want to inform our students and let them know that, hey, you have the tools to respond. And it's important to participate in discussion, and that can be tricky though, because when you've got people heckling you and saying awful things that really cut to the core of your identity, you have to remember that you have the same freedom to respond.
Yeah, I'd like to continue with that as well. I feel like being at a college like this, it can be a good idea to censor hate speech because, let's be real, it can be prevalent. But I also think that there is a way where most things can be discussed without being harmful to the other person. So that's kind of my stance on that.
I would also add an economic concept because I'm studying economics. I think U of A, the problem is transaction costs. It's really difficult to bring together those 45,000 people to agree on something as compared to 5,000 people. And I think that's the issue most of the time between small campus and big campus, that it's easier on small campuses to organize as compared to the big campuses. But at the same time, I think I'm really proud to be at U of A because there's just so much going on. And as an international student, I have like South Asian Student Association. We have so many clubs, 650 plus clubs. So I think it always gives me something that I can do, and I always have this option to choose.
So we're going to go to closing statements in a second. I just wanted to weigh in on this very quickly first. I think that one of the things that often gets conflated and jumbled up when we're talking about hateful speech is the institutional consequences versus social consequences. You will hear somebody saying, well, it's people can't say anything, they're not free to say anything. If I speak my mind, I'm going to be shunned. And it's like, well, yeah, if people think you're a jerk, they're not going to want to hang out with you. That's kind of how being a human being works, right? That none of us is under any obligation to be an audience for hateful speech. None of us is under any obligation to be in dialogue with somebody who is not interested in good faith dialogue. And I think that one of the places that's really important to protect, if you are somebody who is a supporter of the concept of free speech, as I am, is to say that my protection of your right to free speech does not extend to my humoring of anything that you might want to say. Because if you are disrespecting me, if you are behaving like a jerk, if you are demonstrating to me that you are not interested in dialogue, then I can remove myself from you as your audience, and you have not been harmed by me at all. That is not a violation of your rights in any way. All right, so thank you all for coming. I'm not going to wait. No, don't say anything. Don't start clapping. Everybody is going to have an opportunity to make a closing comment, and then I will say a few words wrapping up. But I want to thank everybody so much for coming out. This has been really, really lovely. So why don't we go from that end to this end, and then I will finish us off. Ananya, go ahead. That's right. No, that's right. That's right. I apologize. There are two formal closing comments. Right, that's right. Go ahead.
Sounds great. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Hunter Gibbs, and I'll be rounding out the University of Arizona's perspective on Gen Z activism. Before I begin, I wanted to impart my gratitude to the following: to Ramapo College for providing this beautiful venue at our inaugural forum, to our fellow Ramapo panelists for providing their perspectives, to my fellow teammates on stage, and Riley Haas, our event planner for the UA debate series as well, for helping organize this, and to Angus Johnston for his time moderating and profound insight on campus activism. And of course, our fearless leader, Ted McClue, for providing us this travel opportunity and facilitating weekly discussions leading up to the debate. Now let's proceed into my closing statement. First, I wanted to highlight some of the parallels between Ramapo College and University of Arizona with their experiences with Gen Z activism. First, I wanted to emphasize, once again, our bureaucratic struggles. Dominique, they mentioned how there's an 8 to 9 months turnaround on addressing a complaint that they made, and that in addition, Angus mentions this idea of a Gen Z split, how generations maintain their speaking nature and their values throughout their entire lives, and new generations come in with new novel values that they do not understand. And there's also a misunderstanding of how students are trying to achieve. What they're trying to achieve is not appealing to the nation, but to represent their campuses through their issues, and that students are the core of the campus, and that's something that older generations must acknowledge rather than bashing us in national news. And in the words of Angus, campuses are large enough to matter, but small enough for students to have their individual voices heard as well. And despite our struggles, as I mentioned, with the land acknowledgement and how not a lot is happening with Indigenous rights, and how we are late to the game with our climate action plan, this brings me into my second point on what defines Gen Z, and in terms of issues. Throughout years and generations, there's various movements that define. For example, the boomer generation, the anti-apartheid movement, and the anti-nuclear weapons movement. And Gen X is HIV/AIDS and the grunge alternative culture. And millennials is Occupy Wall Street and marriage equality. And now we are just getting to the point where we are becoming adults and we're defining our own experiences. And one of the questions mentioned how adults doubt us because of our inexperience, but I would argue our inexperience strengthens us. We're not stuck in our ways as older generations are. We're open-minded, and we can turn our struggles and hate against us into collective action. And let's start knocking on administration's door again, in addition to the benefits of social media and other aspects that define Generation Z, and not let us get beat down by older generations. And now I wanted to wrap up one-on-one with members of Generation Z. What we have faced in our lives is no joke. Universities and corporations greenwash or write token statements, providing the illusion of progress while our reality very much remains the same. Media companies report only the worst of news, instilling despair in us and eliminating any prospect of hope for the future. Rights for women have regressed and brutality against minorities remains. And worst of all, for activism specifically, was the pandemic, bringing movements to a grinding halt while the mental health crisis burst out of control. And that's where I was at in 2020, where my depression began thanks to isolation and not being able to express my beliefs freely in front of my family. But after coming to the University of Arizona, I could finally advocate for all the causes that I believed in, especially through climate, growing up in Montana's mountains. I serve as a recommender for a climate action plan and manager of a climate anxiety project. The good happening in climate through a new university climate action plan locally, an Inflation Reduction Act investing $500 billion in new climate technology, inspire me to push even harder than before. And much of these gains are thanks to our advocacy putting these issues on the table. Generation Z. Like most people 3 years ago, my mirror shattered and I couldn't recognize who I was. But in time, I picked up the pieces and began to see myself again. My question for you is this: what will you see in your mirror? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dominique Walton, and I wanted to talk and recap about what we discussed here today. So, our conversation with the students from the University of Arizona is a stride in the right direction. We are returning to the power of discussion and to the students who are both affected, both nationally and college specifically, with issues that may be affecting them. And we don't want this discussion to be a meaningless response. We want this discussion to be the start of change. So I want to remind you all about Ramapo's history when it comes to protest culture. Ramapo has a deep history in the 1970s with protest culture, whether it be faculty members riding their horses to campus to protest, or it may be students trying to go to the government to protest a huge tuition hike. We could do the same, and there's nothing stopping us, really. So the protest culture in both schools, whether it be open to discussions with student association or faculty members, everyone is encouraged to participate. Thanks to the paper, which is the old name for the Ramapo News, Ramapo has archives of all of this information when it comes to protests. And these archives allow us to learn from our ancestors and for Ramapo alumni. Now, Ramapo is such a smaller school compared to University of Arizona, and we have so many more restrictions that kind of suppress the students' ability to hold protests and to organize them effectively without it just being like an archway blast at 1 a.m. the night before. We have some organizations on campus that will help us achieve this goal, like CCEC, which always encourages us to vote, or EDIC, which encourages us to report things of bias concerns that when we see them. And in our discussion today, we have covered a variety of different obstacles on the Ramapo and Arizona campuses, whether it be posters or mobilization, trying to organize things online or in person. It is all deeply difficult. And to emphasize what we all suggested earlier, this discussion should have no response with not a direct result from today. We need to change. There may be only 3 Ramapo students sitting in this panel today and only 3 University of Arizona students sitting here today. But we can ignite conversation, whether it be through our college or nationally.
So on election night 2016, about an hour after it became clear that Donald Trump was going to win. I got a call from a reporter who wanted to know what I thought this meant for the future of American student activism. And I started answering, and we were talking, and she was asking more questions. And about 15 minutes into the conversation, I realized I was getting more and more uncomfortable with the conversation. And it took me a while to articulate why. And eventually I did, and I sort of stopped her in the middle of a question. And I said, so here's the thing. If you had called me 3 hours ago and asked me what it meant for the country that Hillary Clinton was about to win the presidency, I would have had a bunch of really good answers for you. And it turns out that I don't know what is going on in this country because the biggest event in a very long time just happened, and it took me completely by surprise. So the answer, if you're asking me, oh, what does this mean for student activism in the United States? My answer is, I have no idea. I don't know. And that was not only the right answer to give in that moment, although very difficult, right? Because that's not what she's calling me for. It was also a liberating moment because the reality is that our job is not to predict the future. Our job is to be engaged with the present. Our job is not to summarize what is happening. Our job is to be a part of what is happening. And this was the thing that was really exciting to me about this panel, is that this was not the voice singular of a generation. This was not the, us being informed about what is going on. This was 6 individual voices, 6 incredibly articulate and thoughtful voices telling us about what they are experiencing now. And the future will unfold as the future unfolds. But speaking for myself, I feel like I understand the present a lot better than I did 2 hours ago. And I thank you all for that so much. So thank you to Andrew and Hunter and Ananya and Bex and Dominique and Sarah and Kalyani and Riley. This was wonderful. This was just tremendous. Thank you all so much. And thank you all for coming, and thank you for the questions that we managed to get to. I'm sorry we didn't get to more. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.